an unidentified flying object.
Researcher on a mission with Dr. J.N. Elias.
We have an unidentified flying object.
Dr. Joe Buchman, PhD. He's got a PhD from Indiana, an MBA from Purdue in finance. He was also the chair of the Libertarian Party Platform Committee 2013-2014. And where I picked up from him, and I'm sure most of you did, is he was the moderator at the citizen hearing for disclosure, as well as recruited the entire panel of the citizen hearing, which was Senator Gravel and Congressman Merrill Cook and all these other congresswomen and men, except for Congresswoman Kilpatrick. So essentially the majority. Dr. Buchman, welcome to the show.
It's great to be with you, Dr. J.
Well, actually, I wanted to start with you. I want to, since you were such an integral part, how did you even get involved with the citizen hearing? Let's backtrack to that. Or if you even want to go one step further, before we get to the citizen hearing, what got you into UFOs? Because there's not many doctorates that are going into this. Most of us that have this, we have this tinfoil hat painted all over us, when obviously so many people have had sightings or have seen anomalous things or know someone that's seen something. That's the crazy part.
Boy, those are really good questions, and they're questions I ask myself, especially the second question. What am I doing? Why did I destroy any credibility as an academic I might have had left by touching the UFO field of study? Because academics who do that, it's like touching the third rail in politics. You're just done. You're not employable. You're not interviewable. You're not considered credible, particularly. Even Seth Shostak and his team of PhDs there at SETI, they've been fried by touching the third rail of just the search for radio wave communication or lasers and the other stuff that they're doing because of the ridicule factor there. And those guys have hard science PhDs and are reluctant to go down this path. But before I talk about that, I wanted to let you know that I was in Beijing for the 2008 Summer Olympics on August 8th, 2008. And what an incredible experience my son and I had there. The Chinese government is, what do I want to say? The Chinese government is one that I'm glad I'm not subject to. But they do some fun stuff. And one of the things they did for the opening ceremonies was add digitally created fireworks to the broadcast that were not real fireworks shot off outside the bird's nest. So they enhanced the television broadcast with extra digital fake fireworks because the smog was so thick that night in Beijing that you really couldn't see the fireworks that were being shot off around the stadium.
One thing I loved about that, maybe you could elaborate on this. In Beijing, didn't they actually forbid traffic for the leading up to it? How is that?
No, they tried to manage the oppressive smog, by just declaring that people with even or odd numbered license plates. I forget how it worked exactly, but basically it's a government that could just decree if you drive, you go to jail, so don't drive. We can't quite imagine that in America, but we saw it in Boston with the search for the Boston bombers, where they basically declared martial law, forced people into their homes, stopped them from driving, and went on this search for these kids, these alleged bombers. It was that kind of imposition of martial law that was so unprecedented in the United States and is by comparison relatively common in China.
Well, let me ask you this too at the same time, because you mentioned that martial law. And going back to, I believe it was 36 or 38, the Berlin Olympics, from what I heard, at least from watching documentaries, obviously I wasn't alive. I don't know very many people that were alive that were at those Olympics. They put on a show because that was a Nazi Germany before and after, of course. And so during those 2 weeks before and 2 weeks after, they implemented all these rules to make it seem so tourist friendly and this and that. Did you get that feeling in Beijing?
Yeah, very much so. Yeah, my son and I were on Tiananmen Square the night before the opening ceremonies, and there was a big party down there, and I felt the need to be hyper vigilant to be sure we were safe. Um, it was heavily monitored by open security, uniform security, as well as undercover security for sure. People pretending to be tourists who were actually working for the government. See, my first trip to China was everybody. First of all, everybody had to go visit Beijing. I don't want to sound like I'm discouraging people from being tourists in China. My first impression was being disappointed because all the signs were in English and Mandarin, and so here I was, halfway around the world thinking I was going somewhere exotic, and there's Kentucky Fried Chicken and Subway and everything. I remember they even had an A&W root beer, and I was looking out the window of the bus from the airport to the hotel, and I'm like, they have A&W root beer in Beijing. A&W root beer closed in my hometown in the 1980s. I couldn't believe it. But the first time I was on Tiananmen Square, at the gate of Heavenly Peace, and you're there looking at the largest open space in any city on the planet, and there's Mao Zedong's tomb at the far end, and Mao's picture, huge picture of his face there on the gate. And the guards are all standing there with fire extinguishers. Every guard has a fire extinguisher, but this stuff's all made out of stone. Look, why do all the guards have? Every guard has a big fire extinguisher by his feet, and it was because Chinese people will come to Tiananmen Square to set themselves on fire and protest against the policies of the government that they're.
And one thing I remember that was really, really sad, wasn't an American killed there, and wasn't it the father of an athlete?
Yeah, I don't recall during the Olympics that incident. I remember that there was a famous Chinese dancer who was paralyzed rehearsing
Ooh.
for the Olympics because of a failure in the equipment. And that put kind of a pall on the opening ceremonies. I think it happened just a few days before the Olympics. Christian and I, my son and I, had gone to, and I'll come back to the UFO question. I'm not avoiding it. But my son Christian and I, first of all, my family and I had been to Outer Mongolia um, in 1999 or 2000. My wife and I had gone the year before, and then I went to Indiana University where I was a visiting associate professor. And they had Mongolian as a language, and my wife and I decided to take Mongolian as a language because we'd just gotten back from Mongolia. It was a faculty exchange with the college I taught with out here in Utah. And I fell in love with our Mongolian teacher. I befriended him, helped him out getting his daughter admitted to Indiana University. And he offered to host us in Havd, Mongolia, near the Kazakhstan border, the part of Mongolia where China and Russia have a tiny bit of shared border in the Altai Mountains. That's right around where Shangri-La is rumored to be, by the way. But Serampil was from that area of Mongolia in the Altai Mountains in the far west, and he said, why don't you bring your children this year and we'll host you? So my wife and I took 4 children to Outer Mongolia. They were 2, 5, 8, and 11 years old. And we spent a month over there. I don't know if any family in the history of the planet's ever had a better vacation. It was just magical. And so then 8 years later, in 2008, my son and I went back. And this time we went, instead of flying from Ulaanbaatar to Havd, we drove with some Mongolian friends, 3 days cross country, and got to the Altai Mountains in time for the August 1st, 2008 total eclipse of the sun. And it was cloudy and raining the day before. Havd, Mongolia was not a tourist place for eclipse chasers. Most of the eclipse chasers went off into the Gobi Desert where there was a much lower chance of rain. The day of the eclipse, we got to see totality. It was perfect. It was amazing. And the day after, it was raining. So we really lucked out. But I wanted to go back to where I had friends over having slightly higher odds of seeing the total eclipse. And then we went back to Ulaanbaatar, and then Christian and I flew to Beijing and spent 4 days in Beijing for the opening 4 days of the Olympics. Among other things while we were there, by the way, One of my students, I had taught a MBA marketing class in Beijing a few years before in 2005, and one of my students belonged to the Kanjai Presbyterian Church in Beijing, where President Bush and the First Lady and former President Bush and Barbara Bush all went to church on that Sunday, and my former student got Christian and I admitted to the church for those services. It wasn't something tourists could do, but she was a member there. We had to go through Chinese security, Secret Service security, and then a second set of Chinese security to get into the building. But it was amazing. So anyhow, that's my Beijing story. And the air pollution of Beijing is unfathomable.
Well,
If you could,
did it get better from the time you arrived till the time you left? I mean, because I remember seeing that the coverage, they were talking
right.
about it, and of course they tried to quell it, but they couldn't.
Right. Well, I mean, they shut down industry
Yeah.
to the west of Beijing, just turn it all off, told people to stop driving, all of that. But I think the biggest source of smog may very well be dust from the Gobi. And it's not all human created, that's for sure. But yeah, there were concerns for the athletes because of the level of air pollution there. And I recall that. What I recall was how foggy it was outside the bird's nest. We were not in the bird's nest for the opening ceremonies. We were in a hotel across the street, but we walked outside to see the fireworks. When I saw them replayed on TV, I'm like, what? That's not what I just saw. And then the commentators were talking. The Chinese government got caught, and they were talking about it later. We were at a beach volleyball tournament a couple of days later, and I just remember that as blue skies and perfect weather. And then we didn't. We were only there for the first 4 days of the 2.5 weeks or whatever that the Olympics took.
And it was during the beginning, I believe, that this tragedy happened, and I'm pretty sure it was an athlete's father. It was a female runner. I could be mistaken. Maybe somebody out there listening could correct me. But regardless, it's really sad because it's like they hated Americans so bad they must target someone to stab them and kill them. But that's besides the point.
I have the vaguest memory of that, but it would have been suppressed by the Chinese media when we were there.
That's right.
So it would have only been something I would have heard about after we got home.
After you got back, you're absolutely right. And as a matter of fact, I remember journalists here talking about the suppression of what was happening there. If it wasn't favorable to the Chinese, of course, it wasn't going there. But see, now we actually have to be sort of worried because the Chinese, in essence, own us financially. Yeah. They're the number one buyer of homes in the state of California for non-nationalists Chinese. Can you believe that? So people who don't even live here are actually buying homes in California. Moreover, you also have trillions of dollars, or at least $8 trillion of debt worth that we owe them, not to mention all other real estate in this country. We actually have a caller who I do recognize. He is actually a special research consultant, Lou Sheehan, who I believe you met, Dr. Buchman. Lou, welcome to the show. Do you have any questions or comments for Dr. Buchman?
I do, and that's actually a good memory of yours, Dr. J. I have met Dr. Bookman. Doesn't mean he'll remember me. We met
y'all
twice.
Just call me Joe. This doctor stuff's driving. It's well, fun. My dad's an
Joe,
MD and my daughter's an MD, so I'm just Joe.
We all got doctors.
I have a real.
He's got a doctor too. You know that?
Yeah.
Yes, I do. Yeah. And you do too. Dr.
That's right. We all
jurist doc.
Yeah. Both of us do.
Right. It's a real basic question for me with guests up and down the line is why are you interested in UFOs? Have you seen one? Or you accept the testimony of certain others, and if so, which ones? That type of thing. I'm just curious why. I mean, clearly it didn't have a positive impact on your PhD career, according to you. But I am curious, if you don't mind. I'd just always like to hear why people are interested.
Well, I'm sure there's other reasons why my scholarly career is not particularly prestigious. But certainly running for Congress in 2008 as a libertarian, calling for Congress to pass legislation first to protect whistleblowers and then to hold open hearings on waste, fraud, criminal activity, and the reality of the ET engagement with humanity, put me out there all over Google in a way that when I apply for tenure track positions, it's easy for people to go, well, yeah, this guy looks a little bit like a nut. But the question, why did go ahead.
A quick comment there is usually usually it seems like people say they like people who are interesting, who aren't just mundane kind of plug and chug. So that also intrigues. I'm not saying I would expect otherwise. Maybe
Right.
UFOs is just beyond the pale. They usually like individualists. So it's further disappointing that they're not open-minded enough to understand
Well,
it that way. But yes, more to your why you're interested. Sorry.
no, that's okay. I'll make one other point first, and then I'll get to it. I'm not trying to avoid it.
Sure.
Part of the problem
Yeah.
is I don't really know, but I've asked that question myself. But I'll tell you some of my personal history. But the other thing I'll share is that, well, first of all, my experience of most university faculty, political orientations is certainly left leaning. I was at the University of Tennessee, and there, as a libertarian, I was seen as this Tea Party conservative, and I was judged by fellow faculty members on that. Most of them seemed to articulate socialist positions. I moved to Utah. I didn't change my politics at all, and among the Utah faculty in the School of Business at what was Utah Valley State College and is now Utah Valley University, was that I was this flaming liberal. You know, only in Utah would I be seen as diversity for a conservative faculty.
Wow.
That's number one. Number two is
Mm.
I did my MBA in finance and went to Indiana to be mentored by Roland Johnson, who was chair of the Department of Telecommunications and a brilliant human being. And I was going to do a PhD dissertation on fair market valuation of radio stations based on projections of future cash flows and um, uh, that kind of stuff. And Roland and I were having a great time doing that. I was actually doing that for him while he was buying radio stations. And before I got to the point of putting together a proposal, Roland left to go make a ton of money, and he's made a ton of money. He owns like 500 acres of Colorado now, beautiful ranch, looking down at the Air Force Academy. Anyhow, I didn't learn what I really should have learned from Roland. I didn't want to follow him into industry. I wanted to get the PhD, and I was looking at the other faculty there in terms of who I could count on to mentor me to actually get the thing done. And the most brilliant faculty member at the time, probably in the entire College of Arts and Sciences, was Dolph Zillman, a German immigrant to America who was doing human subjects experiments in social psychology and social science physiology. So you expose people to different kinds of media and you measure their biological responses. One of my favorite studies, by the way, was where they invited a bunch of undergraduates to come in for a study, told them they were running late, which was a lie, told them to stay out in the lobby and they could watch some TV while they waited, and there was a remote control there. This was in the late 70s, early 80s, and and when they came in for the actual study, the only question they asked them was, "When did you have your last period?" It was all females, and they were looking at women self-medicating by the kind of television they choose to watch. So the cable channels were all being run from videotape machines in the laboratory. One was comedy, one was drama, one was horror, whatever they had. And they found that women in a PMS state sought out comedy at a higher level than women who weren't. And if they didn't remember when their period was, they gave them a postcard to mail back in the next time they got one. I mean, Dolph was doing that kind of research. Well, the hot subject at the time that Roland left was pornography. So on top of being a libertarian, on top of speaking out about UFOs. The title of my PhD dissertation is Effects of Exposure to Nonviolent Adult Erotica on Attitudes About Criminal Sexual Child Abuse. So,
Ooh.
I
Yeah.
tend not to give a crap about what people think about me. And that's kind of core to who I am. And so that's part of the reason
Right.
I was willing to go down this path. Okay, so
Right.
And that was from the University of Indiana, right?
yeah, Indiana University. It's the University of Illinois, and it's Indiana University to keep UI and IU separate. And Indiana's uptight about that. Indiana is also the home to the Kenzie Sex Institute. One day I was watching
Ah.
Jeopardy back while I was working on my PhD, and Alex Trebek says, "Where's the largest collection of pornography on the planet?" And the answer is Indiana University because of the Kenzie Institute. So that was right there. By the way, what we found, I should talk about this a little bit. We found is that people who expose themselves to nonviolent adult erotica, consenting adults, people who watch that stuff, tend to perceive the suffering of rape victims as lower, tend to feel that the appropriate punishment in terms of number of months in jail or a monetary fine is lower. And this became known as the callousing effect of exposure, or the trivialization of rape as function of exposure to pornography. And we ought to be aware of that, because now there's so much free porn. Even broadcast television and movies are full of so much porn.
Well, go to Europe. Go to Europe. You'll see billboards, with a naked lady holding a bottle of shampoo or whatever it be.
And so we probably see the suffering of women as less than people who don't watch all that stuff for violent crime. But anyway, I'll tell you this, and I haven't talked about this much, but it's something that intrigues me in my memory. And at a very early age, before going off to first grade even, and maybe there's a listener out there, Dr. J, who will have something to share with me that would be helpful. But at a very early age, I have a very clear memory of being out in the yard playing, or in the house playing, or in my bedroom, and hearing a high-pitched tone, kind of like a sort of sound, purer tone than that. And I would stop what I was doing. I would just hear this ringing in my ears. I don't think it's tinnitus. It might be. But I would hear this very loud ringing in my ears that would cause me to stop. And I remember thinking as a little kid that this was some sort of transmission from me back to some spaceship where my real parents were, downloading everything I had experienced as a human being. And that was at the age of 6 or 7.
Yeah, that's pretty young to be thinking those thoughts.
And
I mean, I'm not criticizing you. I'm just saying.
I know.
I remember my thoughts.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
No,
Yeah.
you go ahead. It's okay.
No. I mean, mine were, if we're talking kindergarten, whatever my kindergarten teacher said was right. I remember that. And I happened to go to a Catholic school, so I remember coming home and thinking about Catholic teachings rather than UFOs. So where you get this exposure to UFOs is pretty interesting. So I'm sorry.
No, that's okay. It didn't set me off on a path of UFOs, although I remember as a kid, I cut out a whole bunch of articles from National Enquirer or Weekly World News or whatever, and I pasted them on a bulletin board. And so I had this bulletin board that I covered with stories about UFOs landing on the White House lawn or whatever. So I was doing that at an early age. I remember being completely terrified by a television broadcast of the War of the Worlds movie. And then I got fascinated in high school by Orson Welles and the War of the Worlds broadcast. So I started looking up a lot of microfilm of newspapers in Indiana of the coverage of what was occurring locally as a result of that broadcast. Was it 1938, Halloween 1938, that the Mercury Theater of the Air did War of the Worlds?
I'm not sure.
I want to say that's when it was, but and then I became, I got my undergrad degree in marketing, but I took classes in radio and TV. But I should back up. Two things happened before that. One, when I was 14, I went to Philmont with a Boy Scout expedition, and I saw satellites orbiting the Earth for the first time at night, just after sunset. For about an hour and a half after sunset, you can see the sun reflecting off the satellites. That caught my attention. But at the age of 16, I was fooling around with holograms, and I won a regional science fair in Indiana. And I have the letter here. I think I sent a copy to Dr. J a while ago. But the Wright-Patterson Air Force Base invited me for an all-expense-paid tour of Wright-Pat in, I think it was April of 1972. I'm looking for that thing. I've got it in a...
Yeah, you actually wrote that, the one that invited you from the high school. Yeah, and
I sent that.
I noticed how old it was because there's no even area code on it.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
And what
you
I
mean a zip code?
No. Area code in the phone.
For the phone numbers.
There's no area code in the phone number.
Oh.
Yeah.
They didn't bother.
Wow.
What I remember of that is So they said, well, we're gonna pick you up and we'll drive you to Dayton, Ohio, and it was cool. I was kind of excited. It was one of my first trips on an interstate highway, probably the very first one without my parents going that far away from home. And well, I'd been to New Mexico with the Boy Scouts, but that was like a group trip. This was just me. And I had a friend in scouting who's probably 10 years older than me. He was an adult advisor. I was a kid then. Now we seem like we're the same age. But I guess he's in his 70s and I'm going to be 58. But anyway, Pete said, well, if you're going to Wright Pat, tell him you want to see the UFO that's in Hangar 18. And I said, okay.
Huh.
And so I remember the two guys driving me up there. I have a vivid memory of that trip up. I asked to see the UFO in Hangar 18. I have absolutely no memory of being at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. Don't remember meeting any other kids, having lunch, doing anything. I remember the very end of the drive home. It's almost like I woke up and the guy says, do I turn left to get to your house? And I said, that's right. And the other guy in the front seat turned and said, don't ever say that's right. Say that's correct, because that could be confusing when giving
Yeah,
directions.
right.
I
Correct.
suspect, I don't know, I don't give it a high probability, but I have a suspicion I may have been chemically debriefed. A friend of mine who was in the Army intelligence years later told me that back in the 70s they had no sense of humor about this, and that I may very well have been chemically debriefed. And he thought that
Wow.
because he said one of the side effects of chemical debriefing is you have a very clear memory of just before the drug took effect and a very clear memory burned in just after it wears off.
Oh, what year are you talking about? This is the same era when you got that note, 72?
Yeah, 1972 for that science fair thing.
Wow.
I'll tell you something else. When I was in college, and I've never shared this much of my personal history this openly on the radio show. I've told Steve Bassett this. I've told Linda Moulton Howe this. They've heard these stories. Linda wanted me to go get hypnotically regressed by Leo Sprinkle a decade ago, and I've never done it. I'm open to doing it. I just haven't done it. But I remember when I graduated from Indiana University, I had this compulsion to apply for a job with Sandia Labs, and I'd never heard of it.
Oh my God, really?
Uh-huh.
And
Right.
years later, I looked back on that and thought maybe that was a post-hypnotic suggestion.
That would have been so cool, because isn't some of the greatest technology come from them? And isn't it
Apparently.
rumored that they actually have alien artifacts?
Well, and I was dealing with lasers and holograms, and so maybe that was why. I had done the science fair display where I built a laser out of a kit, and then I showed these holograms of chess pieces. And it was fascinating stuff. And there's a high school newsletter that my mom had saved. I just reread recently where I say that holograms are going to lead to 3D TV, and it's just now happening. Anyhow, so I had this urge to apply for Sandia Labs, and I remember going to the library at IU and looking up I didn't know how to pronounce it back then, by the way. But my best friend from high school had gone to work for Bell Labs. And I thought, well, why don't I want to apply for Bell Labs? Why am I looking up? I looked up Sandia Labs and I looked up the Rand Corporation. But anyway, I didn't follow through on that. I didn't pursue an engineering degree. I wouldn't have been qualified for anything at Sandia, I'm sure. But then the next thing I can think of in the world of UFOs was I got Google Earth, or no, I got Street Atlas from Delorme. It was on a CD. I got Street Atlas, which was this street mapping software, and we bought an RV back in '98 and decided to take our kids out of Utah because we're not Mormon, and we wanted them to see the United States, and the culture of Utah is not typical of the United States, and so we want to get our kids out and around, and so we got this mapping software, and I was looking at creating the route, and I remember zooming in on Area 51, and you could see the roads on Street Atlas that are inside the restricted area, like the big circular roads around all the nuclear test explosions that created these depressions in the earth. And I thought, and you can see the runway at Groom Lake. This was on Street Atlas 97 or something. And I thought, wow, is this even legal? So then we drove there. We went from here to Great Basin National Park to Area 51. It's how we started our big RV trip. We wound up doing 13,000 miles that summer. So this was, in 3 months. By day 2, we were at Area 51.
Wow.
And then we went to the Little Alien, and then we went around and spent the night at a ghost town called Rhyolite on the west side of the base. And I remember just staying up at night looking at the stars, wondering if the mothership would show up. And then we visited a friend, and I want to keep this very vague, but it was a friend who I had been writing on CompuServe. This was kind of before the internet. They had an RV forum, and he was a retired military guy somewhere along our route. And we dropped in, and he had a poster of an old Ronald Reagan movie, and it said, "Dear Bob," or whatever, "thanks for your service to our nation. Always remember, it's not the size of the gun, it's the size of the man holding the gun that matters," right? And it was a picture of Reagan from an old Western holding a gun. And I said, "What exactly did you do in the military?" And he said, "Well, I was a briefing officer for the Joint Chiefs." And I'm like, "Oh my God," And so we're up late talking, and he's like, "Well, how did the trip go?" And I said, "Well, it was pretty cool, but we went up Highway 375, and we went to the edge of Area 51." He said, "Well, promise me you'll never cross the border of that base." And I said, "Well, yeah, but it's kind of confusing. I mean, this is a tourist destination now. The state of Nevada has extraterrestrial highway signs up. There's the little alien. They had the premiere of Independence Day out in the desert, the Hollywood premiere outside of Rachel. That was crazy. And he's like, "Yeah, I don't know why the state's drawing all that attention." I said, "Well, there's international tourists going there, and there's no sign. There's no guard shack. There's no gate. There's just orange posts in the desert. And if you cross the line that's created by orange post to orange post to orange post, you'll be arrested, and there's severe consequences." I said, I remember saying, "I think they ought to put up a sign that says, 'You too invented here,'" And he just laughed and thought that was hilarious. And I said, but there's signs in English that say access by base commander only, or permission base commander only, and use of deadly force authorized. They're only in English, and people drive past them. There ought to be something. There's not even room to turn around when you get there,
Well, then let me ask you this. I've John Lear talks about there being a submarine base and a sign in Nevada that says Naval Submarine Base there. Have you ever seen something like that, or is that just a rumor that he heard?
John Lear makes for great radio.
Yeah, he does.
And I've never seen anything like that. And, it's like down the rabbit hole you go. Where are the edges of credulity and incredulity, and what is disinformation that's created by the government, and what percentage of the people interested in this field are in need of immediate, intense psychiatric intervention? There are clearly some.
Well, were you going to say your friend in the military
So right,
dropped a
so
hint of some sort?
yeah, exactly. So he says, I said there ought to be a U2 invented here or whatever, and he says, don't ever cross the border of that base. And I said, well, why? It's not like we're reverse engineering UFOs out there, is it? And that was the end of the conversation. I mean, it was like we were just having this back and forth engagement. He looks at the floor. I'm staring at him.
Okay.
I look over. His wife is leaning forward in her chair, staring at him. He looks like he's going to cry. And he looks up at our second oldest child and says, Haley, sweetie, you want help putting that puzzle together? I mean, just bam, end of conversation. Now, over the years, this was 17 years ago, over the years, we exchanged emails back and forth. And so Philip Corso's book came out.
97, right?
Right. Or I got around to reading it maybe a year or two after it had come out. Maybe it was when it came out in paperback. But I noticed Corso's book, and I read it, and I realized that this Colonel Corso and this person I'd like to keep as vague as possible were both in the Pentagon at the same time. And so I wrote and said, hey, did you know Colonel Corso? And he wrote back and said, well, yeah, I knew him and his wife really well. Why do you ask? And I thought, oh, man, what am I going to say? So I sent an email. I wish I had it. This was back in Indiana, and I didn't preserve all my emails. But as I remember, I wrote him and said, if you were a librarian 10,000 years from now, would you be more likely to put Corso's book on the fiction or biography section of your library? Right? And he wrote back and said, I love these conversations. I'm looking forward to many more conversations. You're one of our dearest friends. I think it's best if we ceased discussion of this particular topic. I certainly know it would be best
Ah,
for me. End of conversation.
interesting.
Later, his wife
Interesting.
told me, this was years later, his wife told me she was shocked when we came to visit because in all the years of their marriage, her husband had never invited a stranger to their home. And here I show up with my wife and our 4 kids. We had purchased the same model RV, which is part of what got us communicating. So, no, there's
Right.
nothing anybody in the military, there's certainly nothing this individual told me that, in my experience of anything he has said, would violate a secrecy oath. But in the way he didn't say it, I'm like,
Mm-hmm.
whoa. So when I ran for
Right.
Congress, I
Right.
very much had him and others in mind when I say Congress ought to pass legislation protecting whistleblowers. They ought to hold open hearings on waste, fraud, criminal activity, and the ET issue, free people of any secrecy oaths they've signed regarding those 4 issues, and then hold open hearings. So coincident with this, I went to Houston, Texas to visit a friend of mine from scouting, and I'll give his name. I don't think this matters. He became chief medical officer of NASA. His name was Roger Billica, Dr. Billica. Dr. Billica and I had known each other from 1975. We met at a Boy Scout conference, and that conference was every 2 years, and we would have these great reunions. And Roger was part of a team of people that wrote a lot of literature related to scouting, and I was helpful to that. But Roger was a giant in that, and he wanted to fly on a shuttle, and but eventually became chief medical officer. And probably if Challenger hadn't exploded on liftoff and delayed the schedule of launches, he might have got selected for a shuttle crew, but he aged out
Mhm.
because of those delays. But I
Right.
had a speech to give in Houston. And so I go down to Houston. I looked up Roger. I hadn't seen him in more than 5 years. And it was right before the John Glenn shuttle flight. And he said it's really good timing because everybody's kind of taking a break. And, we're going to start the countdown here in a few days. And then nobody will have any time off until the shuttle lands. But what would you like to do? And I said, well, I'd really like to go into that room and hold a moon rock. Could you get me a moon rock? And he's like, no, I don't have access to that. And I said, well, could we go practice in a shuttle simulator, practice some landings at the Cape? And he said, well, I could probably do that with you, but I might get in trouble, Joe. Is there anything else you'd like to do? And I thought, wow, I better play it safe. So I said, well, Roger, I'd really like to sit in the flight surgeon's chair in mission control. And he said, oh, that's no problem. So we drive onto the base. We get, through security. He swipes badges. We go into this building that, by the way, is the most disappointing building I've ever been in my life because it just looked like a college dorm. It was cinder block, government issued furniture, boring, but it was mission control for NASA. And we went into one
Mhm.
of the 2 mission control rooms. They have, mirror control
Well,
rooms.
what space missions were going on at the time?
Well, the mirror was up, and we were
Okay.
getting ready to fly John Glenn on a shuttle.
Okay, so this was before Apollo, obviously. Way
No, no,
before
no.
Apollo. Wait, because
No.
John
Wait, wait.
Glenn.
No. Glenn came back. Glenn
Oh,
came
I
back
didn't
as
know
an
he
elder
came back.
senator.
Yeah. Sorry.
Oh.
So, I mean, your listeners may be confused too. So, John Glenn flew 3 orbits, landed safely, and they wouldn't let him fly again. And he became a United States Senator, and he said, I want to fly on a shuttle. And you don't turn down John Glenn, U.S. Senator, who says, I want a seat on a shuttle.
Damn right
Uh,
you don't.
but it was total politics at the time. And I wish I could remember the year. Somebody can Google this and let me know. I think it was in
Right.
the
Right.
late 90s. But at the time, NASA was saying, we're going to study geriatrics. This will be great. We can look at aging in space.
Yeah.
And I'm like,
Right.
who's believing this? This is not science. This is one individual.
Right.
You can't generalize
Right.
one individual. So when I saw Roger, I said, Roger, what's all this bullshit about? This is internet radio. I can say that, right? Sorry, John. But I'm just quoting myself. What is all this BS about uh, scientific
Sending up John
research?
Glenn.
Sending up
Yeah.
John Glenn.
Yeah.
And now I have used this in classes ever since. Dr. Billica says to me, well, Dr. Buchman, here at NASA, when we have one data point, we'll write a report that says, our recent experience has shown us that. If we get 2 data points, we'll write a report that says, in a recently concluded series of studies, we have proven that. And if we have 3 data points, we'll write time after time after time. It has been proven. And I'm just laughing hysterically because that's what they do. And the bottom line was, if Neil Armstrong wanted to fly on a shuttle, you put Neil Armstrong on a shuttle. You gave
Right.
those guys a seat. So it was a political thing. But and thank God John Glenn, got back safely, and that wasn't Columbia coming apart on reentry.
It says STS-95, which was in 1998.
Very cool. So
So you remember that? Good memory, Lou.
No, I looked it up. That's
Oh,
why.
okay. That's
My
that's
goodness.
why.
Yeah.
very
I
cool.
just remember he was an elder senator at the time.
Well,
Yeah,
between
it was
my
clearly
friend,
politics, but
Yeah.
but let me one real quick observation. I'll make it super quick. Georgina Bruni, when talking about the Rendlesham case, said Gordon Williams, who was
Gordon
essentially
Cooper?
truly the base commander.
Okay.
No, Gordon Williams. He was essentially the base commander, the real base commander. After he retired, he came back to visit her more than once. And one time he came back, and on his cap it said, "The truth is out there." Rendlesham, 1980. These people struggle to communicate what they're not allowed to communicate.
yes,
If I'm saying that, because he had no real reason to visit her in England. He was a retired general by then, Air Force general, big wig, and he comes to visit this lowly reporter who was writing a book about UFOs, the Rendlesham matter, the Bentwaters Rendlesham matter. So again, I'm kind of drawing an analogy to your friend who the best he could do was stare at the ground. Yeah.
Well,
Okay.
and
Sorry.
in both of these individuals, men of high rank and station, of incredible integrity. Neither, and Roger was I believe, a fundamentalist Christian of some sort in a big church outside of Houston. My other friend, also very religious. I won't mention what denomination, but very active in his church. And I got the impression from each of them that they would not lie to me about this subject. And they could have lied in a truthful way. It could have been, well, you can't believe everything you read, and change the subject. But each of these encounters were fascinating. So after I do the flight surgeon's chair and all that, we come out in the hallway. There's a weekly world news. Bill Clinton greets alien coming off the shuttle.
Right.
I'm like, well, you guys have a sense of humor. We go back to his apartment, and I said, we don't have flying saucers shadowing our shuttle missions on orbit, do we? And so my friend says, well, before I respond to that question, I have 3 questions for you. And I said,
Okay.
yeah. I remember this. This is just like such an intense.
Sure.
He says,
Right.
you think I've ever lied to you? I said, no, we were Eagle Scouts together. And no, I don't think he says, do you think there's anything anybody could ever do to me to cause me to lie to you? And I said, no, I think you and I both look at life on Earth as a trial, and there's a greater life in a world to come, and we're being tested here. And when you have that perspective, no, I think you could be tortured and you wouldn't lie as a matter of integrity. I said, okay, well, my 3rd question is, where do you want to go to lunch? And I said, well, I want to go to that Chinese place that's in the right stuff where all the astronauts hang out. And he said, that closed years ago, but I'll take you out to lunch and maybe we'll see an astronaut. We'll go someplace where they hang out. And at lunch, he says, look, Joe, as much as I might like to talk about certain subjects with my wife, if I were to do so, I would go to a place worse than Leavenworth. She would lose the pension and health care and everything else. And I'd never be heard from again. So please don't ever ask me that question again.
Huh. Wow.
Really?
I'm sure you're exposed to Brad Sparks and his when he appears in movies and videos talking about Skylab 3, I believe it was.
Oh yeah, I have read
Oh,
about that.
there's a famous movie by Stanton Friedman's nephew, Paul. I'm trying to remember his last name. Um, Red
Martin?
Star Red Star Films, the top 10 UFO sightings. I can send you the link. It's a free movie online, and it's a really good movie. It's a very good movie. So,
Well,
if
John
you don't
Al-
mind, I'll send it to you. But
No, I would love
pardon me?
that. I would love that. John
Yeah.
Alexander told me about Skylab 3, and he considers it one of the most credible cases where they saw, a bright
Yes.
object clearly behaving in non-conventional ways, and they tracked it, I think, over the course of more than an hour, and then it went behind the limb
Yep.
of the Earth into
I
darkness
believe
and
it's something
disappeared.
like on 140 feet in size, if my
Yeah,
memory serves, and it's been a long time.
yeah.
But Brad Sparks discusses it, and Paul, what's his last name? That's terrible. Oh, it'll come to me. But nevertheless, he's of all people Stanton Friedman's nephew,
Yeah.
who, by the way, does not believe in or does not buy MJ12, which I think is interesting. Must be some interesting family reunions when those two get together. But those are my questions. They're great questions, and this is a keeper, Dr. J.
Thank
It's a
you.
great
He
interview.
really was. And, I've
Yeah.
wanted Dr. Bookman since the citizen hearing. Even before that, I knew of him, but I didn't know how insanely important he was to the world of ufology, literally
That, but
until I
even just his
watched the
experience.
citizen hearing.
Well, and we haven't even talked
Yeah.
about how I got involved with the citizen hearing.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
that
Okay, so that's
question
a question for you. And I should hang up because I don't want to dominate the call-in. So I definitely want to get you this link. And if John Peter, if Dr. J could forward it to you, I'd appreciate it.
Yeah.
Would you be
By
able
all
to do that?
means. Yeah. Send
Okay,
it
will
via
do.
Skype
Will do.
or
you know, you,
It's an excellent movie, by the way.
yeah,
Excellent.
send
And
it via
Stanton's in
Skype and
it.
I'll get it to him before the end of the show.
Okay, thanks a lot.
No problem. Thank you,
Thank you.
Lou. And by all
Bye.
means, if you have more questions out to anybody out there who has questions, feel free to call in 818-923-1713. Again, 818-923-1713. And of course, I will repeat that number when we come back from break, which we come back in about 5 minutes. Now, is it okay if I call you Joe to make it short?
please.
Okay, or you're the other Dr. J. So
That's
if we
fine
say, I'll
too.
say Dr. J too. Okay. Anyhow, we might as well start with the citizen hearing because I know it's going to carry over. Let's go backtrack to how you got involved. I mean, did Bassett approach you? You approach him? Did you already know these members or retired members of Congress and Senator Gravel? Because actually, for those listeners out there who don't know, he's been on the show several times, and I just recorded him last week. Now, the poor guy is 85, I think 86 years old. He
Right.
can't do live radio, so I'm telling you all this now. When you hear this interview, it will be a pre-recorded one, and it was very short. It was only 20 minutes. That's the best I can get out of him, and he's agrees to do more. He has no problems doing more, but he could only do them in those short blocks before you could hear him start to, breathe heavily and just sort of saying, "Can we do this tomorrow or later?" So,
Thank you for preserving that and being the one to get those interviews. That's going to be priceless.
it really is.
And
Yes, he's a
I have
great guy. He's such a great guy.
I don't even know where to start in answering all those questions. So which one do you want me to start with?
Well, how did you get? I want to go back to the political aspect before we
Yeah.
go to break. Did you know any of these members, or did you just reach out to them?
Well, I knew of Merrill Cook because I remember seeing his advertising when he ran for Congress here in Utah. Senator Gravel ran for the Libertarian presidential nomination.
Right in '88, or no, not '8. Was it the year? What year was it? It was with.
2008.
Okay, that's right.
And
That's right.
I was so thrilled to be a delegate to that convention. It was in Denver in 2008. And I was excited to have a chance to meet Senator Gravel, who's a hero. This is the man who read the Pentagon Papers into the congressional record to cease the persecution of the New York Times for publishing them to give them protection by calling a meeting of the Building and Grounds Committee in the middle of the night in order to read it in the congressional record. He's a whistleblower. He's a stand for that. His statements during the citizens hearing were encouraging others to tell the truth and not be intimidated by fear of reprisal by the government. And you got to love Senator Gravel. So I had met him in Denver. He did not get the Libertarian presidential nomination that year. He lost out, unfortunately, to Bob Barr, but self-identified still as a libertarian. And
He still does to this day.
yes. Democrat, libertarian, left-leaning libertarian. I consider myself a left-leaning libertarian. I come to libertarianism through the pacifism doorway, which is that we really don't have the right to force other people to do things against their will. And so much of the social agenda of both the Republicans and Democrats ultimately boils down to at the point of a gun. You know, your productive efforts are taken by force without your consent in the form of various kinds of odious taxation that dampen the ability of the economy to grow, which would really benefit the poorest of the poor. And ultimately, it comes down to the threat of violence if you don't do what our politicians desire us to do in order to accomplish the social ends they think would be good for us. And generally, they have a lot of unintended consequences. So I think no human being has the right to initiate force or violence against another. And you can derive politics from that paradigm of philosophy, which is called natural law, the natural law of the non-initiation of aggression, and then the right of self-ownership, the meat bucket that you're in. You have the right to eat, drink, smoke, or have sex with anything you choose to, so long as it's all done non-violently and without risk to others. You don't get a car and drive when you're high, but there's no reason people shouldn't do whatever they want to do in the privacy of their home. That kind of libertarianism is where Gravel came from as well. And so I had those two connections. First, Lynn Hooley Lynn Woolsey and Darlene Hooley, and Carolyn Kilpatrick and Roscoe Bartlett. I did not know prior to recruiting them to be in the hearing.
Yeah, that was the only one that you didn't bring, right?
Carolyn.
No, Carolyn Kilpatrick. It was Roscoe that you brought.
Right. Yeah, and Roscoe was a late addition. By the way, there were probably a dozen other former members who were willing ultimately to serve on that hearing that we turned away. I mean, I recruited a lot more than those five. Steve had recruited Carolyn at my urging. I drove him to the post office to get the first invitations to go out, and she had responded but said, "Please keep my name private till I know who else is going to be on the committee." And weeks went by with no second member. And so Steve had called me and said, I've got one member who's going to quit. I haven't got anyone else, and we're going to have to refund Tom Clearwater's money and cancel the hearings, and I don't know what I'm going to do. And I said, Steve, give me 48 hours. Just give me 48 hours. Let me see what I can do. And he was like, well, okay. And in less than 48 hours, I think in 12, I got both Merrill Cook and Senator Gravel. And then once that was announced, that kept Carolyn. And then we fairly quickly got Lynn Woolsey and Darlene Hooley. But then we were going to have five members. There were only supposed to have been five. If you look at the pre-hearing promotions, it was five former members. But Roscoe Bartlett was such a terrific find that ultimately they came up with the extra $30,000 or so. It was $20,000 to the member plus expenses for him and his spouse. Roscoe actually was cheap because he commuted home every day back to his ranch in Northern Virginia, or West Virginia maybe. But
was any of them prior to this? Obviously, we're going to go to break soon, but I want to get to this before. Were any of them? Obviously, they all came in on the fence, and I remember watching literally the transformation over those 5 days, going from.
Oh, it was incredible.
Yeah. But were any of them, closeted believers? Do you think? Did you get that impression?
Absolutely not. But what happened? And people said, "Oh, $20,000 for a week. These people are overpaid," which is absurd, because in addition to doing 5 8-hour days, and it was rough on Mike Gravel. He took a couple hours off one afternoon to rest. It was hard on all of them. They did a ton of homework before the event. They've gotten paid nothing after the event, and many of them have continued to be very helpful. But I think some of them, like Merrill especially, wanted to read every book, everything at Dolan's, a lot of videos that we sent them. So we sent them a packet of material at least a week or two out from the hearings. I know Steve wanted it to be even earlier than that, but eventually they got a packet of books and videos to do their homework before they showed up in D.C. Carolyn certainly did her homework. Dr. Bartlett, the guy has a PhD.
Yes, he does. That's right.
I know Merrill did. The others, he's
got an MBA from Harvard. Yeah.
And something like 11 patents with NASA. He created the breathing apparatus that Neil Armstrong used on the moon and that firefighters use today to rush into burning buildings. The man's a genius. He didn't run for Congress till he was 65. That was his second career.
Really? I didn't know that.
Then he served 20 years. He was 85 years old as well.
Yeah, I didn't know that. I definitely knew he was the oldest member, but I didn't know he served 20 years. That is definitely of it. Now, what are they're not 4-year terms, aren't they? 6-year terms
Two.
or 2-year terms? Oh,
2 years for the House, 6 years for the Senate.
wow, wow. So yeah, he definitely served a lot of times there. That's more than
10
I imagined.
elections. Yeah.
I want to turn to you, Dr. Joe Bookman, and ask you, where can people find you? What websites do you have? Any material, anything you'd like to promote?
Well, I own a handful of websites. All of them are in desperate need of updating. But the one most relevant to your show is www.thepeopleofearthapologize.com. www.thepeopleofearthapologize.com. And this was a website I put up in 2007. I had done an intense workshop where we were kind of looking at, what can you do to maximize the positive difference that your life can make on the planet? Where are you gonna give yourself over to a big problem? One of the things we got out of that workshop, and gosh, I could go on for another hour about those. But if you think you have problems in life, if your problems are getting you down, it's because your problems are too small. What you really need to fix that is a bigger problem. So if your problem is, your wife is horrible to your spouse, whatever, your job is a drain, your house is falling apart, those are problems and they're bringing you down. But take on the problem of ending war on the planet, or take on the problem of no more children starved to death in America tonight, or take on the problem of, some great social issue. And I thought, well, what's the biggest problem I could imagine? And this was before I ran for Congress. This was before I had anything to do with citizens hearing. And I thought, boy, if there are aliens here and they're watching us, it must look like a pretty depressing show.
Very, I would think so.
Stan Friedman's the best at articulating this. If it's a junior high school level alien anthropologist looking at the Earth over the last 10,000 years, primary activity of humanity, killing each other, primary economic activity, developing ever more, efficient ways of raising money to kill each other, primary technological activity, developing ever more horrifying ways of killing each other. And so it looks pretty awful. And I can imagine a loving Heavenly Father or a loving Creator or a benign, kind of cold observing alien like H.G. Wells at the beginning of War of the Worlds.
Shaking their head, probably, huh?
Well, if not crying,
Yeah.
Not favorably impressed.
Well, you're absolutely right. When I think of the fact that the Manhattan Project, we figured out how to split an atom, create a nuclear reaction. Instead of figuring out, okay, let's power a submarine or a battleship, what's the first thing we do? Let's bomb a country. That's what we did. So, yes, I totally see where you're coming from. Look, from the outside looking in, I think it's the most, the saddest thing you could think about. Joe, you still with us?
I'm sorry, I hit my mute button.
Oh, that's okay. By all means.
I'm here gesturing while I'm talking. So the two things. One is we didn't need to bomb Japan. From what I'm reading of history, the generals at the time, including Eisenhower, did not want that weapon used. Japan may very well have surrendered. We could have done something else, but we needed it for greater geopolitical posturing with the Russians or whatever, apparently. It's horrifying. I hope to live long enough someday to see a president of the United States apologize for our actions 70 years ago. Like I said, I come to libertarianism through the pacifist left-leaning side. I'm not a neocon. I'm not a Tea Party character, which is how libertarians get branded sometimes. But and so I imagined that an alien looking at Earth was very much like me looking at my children when they pulled every pot and pan out of every cabinet in the kitchen and made this unbelievable mess of things. And what do I want them to say to me when I come in? And I could be angry with them, and they certainly have some fear when they see me, much like we might have those kind of reactions to an advanced alien presence. And what I want to hear from them is, Dad, I'm sorry. I don't know how to fix this mess. Will you help me? And so out of that thinking came the People of Earth Apologize.com. I also have josephbookman.com. I haven't updated that in a while. That's sort of my professional site. I have nightcaps.net, I think, or maybe it's nightcaps.org, which is a tribute site to Herb Jepko, who was a late night radio talk show host. He was the first American network late night radio talk show host. He did a show called the Nightcap Radio Network. Maybe some of the listeners remember the song, We're the Nightcaps, Nighty Nightcaps. It was hugely successful. He had a magazine, a travel agency, a supplemental life insurance company, specialty products like you wouldn't believe. They had listeners organized into local social service clubs called nightstands. They had annual conventions. The magazine was called The Wick. And it was like the internet before the internet. These listeners were connected by the old medium of radio, but they wanted to see each other's pictures and they wanted pen pals. They wanted to write each other, and so they published addresses and photographs in the magazine called The Wick, along with recipes and other fun stories. And it was just horrible. It's just a dreadful show. My first job in radio, 1976. Was working midnight to 6 a.m. as a board operator for the Herb Jepko Nightcap Show. And mostly it was little old ladies calling in and asking how the weather was in Salt Lake City. It was just unbelievable. At any rate, there's nightcaps.net. I wrote a chapter for Mike Keith's book about late night radio, about the nightcaps. You can find a PDF of it there. I have atlaslisted.com, which is a tribute site to Ayn Rand in the novel Atlas Shrugged. Before he shrugged, he listed, meaning he leaned a little to the side, but also I made a list. I attempted to create a census of every character in Atlas Shrugged. And that crazy woman introduced a new character every page and a half for 1,300 pages. There's 700 individuals you can identify in that novel. So I threw that up. And then it seems like I must be forgetting another site or two that I own or manage. But my favorite is thepeopleofearthapologize.com, and I've not updated that in probably 2 or 3 years. But if the listeners want to send in an apology by email to me, I will make a promise to get that website updated before Thanksgiving.
Well,
And
by all means, if you want to spit out your website and you're open for it, go ahead.
yeah, sure. It's thepeopleofearthapologize.com, and you can find an email link there. I'm pretty easily Googleable. My email and phone number are out there. I'm not hard to find. And you're welcome to share that, Dr. J, with anybody if it becomes a problem.
It will. I will absolutely put it in the description link when this goes to YouTube. Absolutely.
And the reason I say I can't update the websites till Thanksgiving is right now I'm packing to go to Burning Man.
Ah, that's right. We're talking about that off air.
Be my 6th year out at Burning Man, out on the playa northwest of Reno. 2 years ago, we did Cargo Cult, and the man was on top of a wooden flying saucer, which was incredible. We did
Nice.
TED Talks at Burning Man. I've done TEDx Talks out there. Elon Musk will be out there, the founders of Google.
You did TEDx Talks? I didn't know that.
Yeah.
One of my good friends, Nassim Harriman, actually did TEDx Talks.
Wow.
Yeah.
I've just done one, and just in Black Rock City. But there's a lot of lectures and education that goes on at Burning Man. It's not all a rave or a party or hedonistic. The art, the technology, the solar power generation, the lasers, the fireworks, the art cars. It's like a physical manifestation of the internet. Everything you can imagine and more is out there. I understand this year, by the way, they're bringing out a fuselage from a 747 to use as an art car on the playa. I can't imagine. But anyway, I'm going to be gone to Burning Man, then I'll be in San Francisco for a couple of weeks, and so I won't be home to update stuff. I'll be traveling, and right now I'm crazy packing my RV and getting ready for 2 full weeks out there. I just got my early admission pass today, but I'll be out there a week early working with the Burning Nerds. There's 3,000 PhDs who go to Burning Man, organized as the Burning Nerds, and one of the things we do is the census of who's at the burn. So we have surveys, and we interview people about where they're from and why they're there and what their political affiliation is and what their income is and all that standard social economic status stuff. But real quickly, to answer the question about the citizens hearing, I ran for Congress in 2008. Steve was doing X conferences. I called him up and said, "Hey, I'm on the ticket. I'm running as a libertarian. I'm calling for disclosure." And he said, "Let me Google you. I'll call you back." And he called me back and said, "My God, you're the third candidate for federal office to ever call for disclosure. The first was Jimmy Carter, the second was Stephen Bassett, and the third was me." And he said, I have no money, but if you can make your way to the X conference, I'll give you a VIP pass and a free dinner. I said, that's good enough for me. So I paid my way out to D.C. I met Edgar Mitchell. I met Paul Hellyer. I met C.B. Scott Jones. I met John Alexander. I mean, what an incredible conference Steve put on. Whatever complaints people have about Steve Bassett, the product he produces, from the X conferences to the citizens hearing to whatever he does, when he does it, it's total A+ quality, pristine, incredible events and content beyond anything I had imagined. And I announced my campaign for Congress at the National Press Club in Washington, D.C., at the press conference that Steve Bassett had organized there. The Salt Lake Tribune came and covered me with their DC-based reporter, which was fantastic. And so Steve, I have a lot of gratitude to Steve Bassett. He is a hero. The man is tilting at windmills. He's dedicated his life to it. I wish he had been on time with Art Bell the other day, but Steve doesn't manage time and technology as well as I do, or we all wish he would. I'll say that as a criticism. I hope it's mild enough that it doesn't feel hurtful. But I've seen his computer break down at Contact in the Desert and other conferences. I could just see that happening the other night when he was supposed to be on with Art. But anyway, Steve's X conferences were incredible. So I became a supporter. I consider him a dear friend. He moved to L.A. and started working with Reuben Langdon. They had the ET Media meetups going on in Hollywood with 80, 100, 120 people showing up. Incredible events. I would get down there as often as I could. I would make sure I bought Steve dinner and put gas in his car or did whatever I could to help. And he called me up. I had just been down there, and it looked, he's literally, couch surfing. He lives very modest means. He doesn't take any of his supporters' money for his own well-being. The bare minimum. And so here he is sleeping on a couch. I've just put gas in his car. I come home and he calls me up and tells me he got $1.1 million from a Canadian, and he's going to put on the citizens hearing. This was, I think, in October or November that he called me, and I said, "Hey, I'm in Park City, Utah. You guys should come out and promote the Truth Embargo movie that will be based on the citizens hearing at Sundance." Stephen Greer had just been there promoting Sirius the year before. And so I helped just a little bit in the end, but I helped some with the Park City Sundance events in February of 2013, late January, February 2013. That's when I said, "Who are the Congress people?" And he told me he hadn't invited them yet. And I literally drove him to the post office to mail out the first 50 invitations. It was a couple of weeks later, maybe a month later, that he called and told me he was going to have to cancel everything. And I got on the horn and found Merrill and then Mike Gravel and then Lynn and Darlene, and then ultimately Roscoe.
I'm sure as one came, it was easier to get the rest.
Yes, and once, but the number one is hard.
That's right.
Nobody wants to be first to be the UFO congressperson, and Carolyn Kilpatrick is a hero for that. She was first. So was Merrill, because Merrill didn't know about Carolyn, and then Mike came in, and once we had the three of them, that broke the ice. And by the time we had the five, there were probably another half dozen to a dozen Congress people who wanted to do it. I can think of one especially that we turned away, that I argued with Steve. I thought we should go to 7 former members of Congress, but they just couldn't afford it, and that would have been unwieldy, and we had to cut it off somewhere. And then after the event, Steve showed me a letter from a former member of an intelligence committee that would have liked to have done it, but he was out of the country for 3 months and didn't get the letter till that fall. So there were more than the 6 who were willing to do it.
I wish we would actually have the entire House, entire Senate actually committed to really looking into this. But at the same time, I get the feeling that even if that was to happen, I don't think we'd ever get disclosure, because if everything down the rabbit hole is true, I mean, the things that you could at least prove For instance, all the suicides that are too good to be true. People who
Yeah.
have so many good things going in their lives, and obviously they have suicide notes written in handwriting that's not theirs, or different things like that, or people that are just broke through on an amazing patent and all of a sudden are found shot dead with the in their head wearing a bulletproof vest in the middle of the desert. Come on, who does that? Anyway, I just think it's if all
Yeah.
that's true, why would POTUS ever go to the White House lawn? And everybody who's listening has probably heard this say this every time. I think now, and you could answer this, Joe. Do you think that this is my opinion? Do you think that things, artifacts, craft, beings, dead aliens, all that is now in control of private military contractors as opposed to the actual military, which would forbid them from being part of FOIA requests?
Well, yeah, Richard Dolan writes about that. I think that's reasonable. I have no knowledge, no proof, no insight, no special anything that anybody's ever told me about any of that. But I read what Dolan writes. He talks about this breakaway civilization and how you do protect from FOIA requests by going into contractors. That feels intuitively correct, but I couldn't say I know it to be true. By the way, the one website I forgot to mention, I really should have. It's not mine, but citizenshearing.org. Go to
That's right.
citizenshearing.org and buy the DVDs. Reuben Langdon, was huge in causing the citizens hearings to happen. He was very much behind the scenes. He was the founder of Just Cause Productions. He is an honorable man of integrity. He's lost his business and gone on to back to his work as a stuntman, making movies, living in Atlanta now.
Yes.
But and then the Truth Embargo documentary is I'm not sure what the status
Don't forget
is.
Jeremy Corbell. Jeremy
I was-
Corbell's a big factor in all this too.
I was just about to mention Jeremy, and he's directing that, working on that along with the Roger Lear film and other filmmaking work that hopefully will provide a lot of weight and gravitas toward causing disclosure. I'm interested in disclosure. That's Steve's thing. Stephen Greer too. I did his contact ambassador to the universe training in Crestone, Colorado, back in 2005. Spent a week with Dr. Greer. Their passion and dedication to causing disclosure is incredible. Personally, I'm more interested in open contact. The idea that we have a human being who says aliens are real and they've been here and they're kind of around, that doesn't give us open contact. I want to have a conversation with one of these guys. That's what I'm looking forward to. And I think if they want to have open contact, that the place they might show up first, and they could already be there and not be noticed, even more intense than Las Vegas for this, is Burning Man. So I'm hoping the aliens will show up in 2 weeks when I'm
I
out.
think so, because that's where all the happiness and people are open for it, or, open mind are going.
You want to meet the safest, most artistic, most self-expressed human beings on the planet. They're at Burning Man.
Yes. Let me say this. We got about 30 minutes left, a little over 30 minutes left. I want to say if anybody out there would like to ask a question, of course, you could either Skype in at Dr. J Radio Live, or you can use Twitter at, make sure you use hashtag DM Talk, as in Dark Matter Talk, DM Talk, and I will see it in the Twitter feed. Or, of course, for those of you in the TuneIn chat room, we have Joshua Chares, who is watching that, and I got to give a shout out to all the chat rooms out there, and the Echo chat room too in Facebook. We do have Lou back. Lou has another question, and then I know Johnny's got a question. Go ahead, Lou.
Two things. I never hear, when I was growing up, I knew Senator Gravel for the Pentagon Papers. He read over half the Pentagon Papers into the Congressional Record. I don't know if you guys are aware of that. He really pushed their release. Another person leaked them, but then President Nixon got involved and tried to suppress them, but Senator Gravel just took them and read them into more than half of them into the Congressional Record. So he was very much for open government at the time, and the Pentagon Papers.
I mentioned that earlier.
Oh, did you?
Mentioned that earlier.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear
okay.
that.
He called it. He
Um,
was chair of the Buildings and Grounds Committee. That was what he was chair of as a senator from Alaska. And in a late night meeting of the Buildings and Grounds Committee, he read the Pentagon Papers into the congressional record because that becomes public at that point. And he protected Daniel
right,
Ellsberg, who was the original whistleblower,
right,
who was being
right,
threatened by
right.
everything Nixon and his administration could bring
Yep,
against both Ellsberg and the New York Times. And because of Gravel's
yep.
actions, that persecution was stopped in its tracks.
Essentially, yeah, made mute. So it was a big thing. And he also had a lot to do with ending the draft, whether you support that or not. The movie is called Best Evidence, Top 10 UFO Sightings by a man named Paul Kimball. It's available free on Vimeo. I wanted to get that out to your audience, Dr. J.
Yeah,
It's an
that's right.
excellent
You sent
UFO
that on
movie.
Twitter. As a
Yeah,
matter of fact, I believe
yeah.
two other people have tweeted it. Graviton Fish, if I'm not
Oh, great.
mistaken, sent that out, as well as who else sent that out? With Jeff and
Well, the
Friends.
main
No,
thing
that
is to
was
get it to your listeners.
yeah,
I'm
that's
sorry.
right, that's right.
Yeah. Okay, well, thank you both for your time, and I'll let others call in.
Johnny, go ahead. I
Right.
know you got something to ask. Johnny
Thanks.
Webb, who normally is live in London, is actually right now live in Indonesia. Go ahead, Johnny.
Good evening, guys, or afternoon. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we're in evening, morning for you.
It is indeed, yeah. My question to Joe, and good afternoon or evening to you, Joe. What made you want to disclose on UFOs, and what did you think is happening today in the government to bring about disclosure, or do you think we're still being stonewalled?
Well, obviously, we're still being stonewalled. My perspective is that the United States Congress has abandoned its constitutional role to the executive branch. They've created an overly powerful executive. They have been sometimes coerced into doing that, but they have abandoned their work ethic, their authority, and that what was needed, as I said back in 2008, was first of all legislation protecting whistleblowers, people like Chelsea Manning and Snowden and Assange. There's a statue that just went up in Berlin to those three. So the
I didn't
world
know that.
looks
Wait a
like,
minute, wait, back that up. Did you say a
yeah,
statue went up
yeah.
for all three?
Yeah, Google that. It's in Berlin. It's a
Wow.
statue to those guys as heroes on the planet. But we persecute them. We don't just prosecute them, we persecute them. So, first of all, you got to protect the whistleblower. Colin Powell, by the way, in his book on leadership, chapter 1, Protect the Skunk in Any Organization. The person who raises a stink cares about the organization. And you got to protect the skunks. You got to protect the whistleblowers. So we don't protect them. This administration, the Obama administration, has gone after whistleblowers at an unprecedented level that makes George Bush look like he was a friend to them, and he was no friend to them. So we have inside our federal government federal employees who report crimes or misdeeds who, rather than being rewarded for that, for saving taxpayer dollars or blowing the whistle on criminal activity, are persecuted, and maybe to the point of fake suicides. I don't know, but they're certainly prosecuted, and there's certainly a fear of reporting misdeeds as a culture inside our federal government. Well, that's got to end. Congress could end it. Congress still has the power to pass that kind of legislation, and then protecting whistleblowers on waste, fraud, criminal activity, and the extraterrestrial issue. I mean, if the scientific community thinks this is a joke, what harm does it do to free people from secrecy oaths around ETs? But if there are such oaths, wouldn't we all be really interested in what those folks might have to say in an open congressional hearing in the same way that Mike Gravel did that? And if Congress doesn't have that authority anymore, if somehow they could be stopped from doing that, then as Gravel said during the citizens' hearing, we really do live in an America that's part of a military junta. We just didn't notice that it occurred unless you notice the Kennedy assassination and tie that in. And I don't know about that. But by God, I would like to see open congressional hearings where they recruit whistleblowers to come testify in a way that we can stop the crimes and misdemeanors of our federal government, and we can have whatever truth there is about what people know inside of government about extraterrestrials. I hope I live long enough to see that, but I don't have high confidence that I will.
Johnny's got another question. Then
Well, really, yeah, it's a follow-on question.
Go ahead, Johnny.
Sorry, yeah, it's a follow-on. Basically, we've got Bradley Manning being locked up for 1,000 years, and then we're asking, Snowden to come over and to face trial. And it is really not going to get a trial like any normal circumstances because it's a politically motivated trial. So, this, what you're saying is really hard, and I don't think that's going to happen unless you get literally autonomy, and I don't think
Right.
that's going to happen either.
Well, I mean, you still hope that the American people could rise up and demand it. Governor Johnson, who is the Libertarian presidential candidate in 2012, former two-term governor of New Mexico, man with some political gravitas, got over 1 million votes in 2012. But Governor Johnson said in that campaign, if I'm elected president, one of my first executive actions will be to grant amnesty to these individuals. Well, wouldn't you have liked to have heard that in the presidential debate, this staged fake debate between Romney and Obama? If we had Governor Johnson in there, perhaps the Green Party candidate, Dr. Stein, 4-candidate debate. We just saw Fox News carry off a 17-candidate debate. Let's hope that in the fall of 2016 or the late summer, we can get more than the Republican and Democrat in the United States presidential debates. And if there's a libertarian there, I'm virtually certain the libertarian candidate will find a moment to say, I will grant executive amnesty to whistleblowers inside of my administration. I want Snowden home. I want Chelsea Manning freed from prison. This is not the America that our founders stood for.
Do you know
The odds of that happen?
I actually have on record Snowden calling, Senator Gravel calling Edward Snowden a true hero. Anyone can Google this. You can find this. U.S. Senator calls Snowden hero. Just Google this. Yes, it's under Third Phase Moon, but it is an interview that I conducted with him that ended up going on their channel because of the exposure. But the point being is I got a former retired United Senator to say that he's a hero when you have the Attorney General of the United States saying, we'll take the death penalty off the table if you just come back here, plead guilty, and we'll give you LWOP, which in legal terms is life without parole. Very ridiculous. Anyway, we have Tom Schaefer. Tom, will you hang tight because Chris has got a question real quick. Go ahead, Chris, then we'll turn it over to Tom Schaefer. Go, Chris.
Thank you. Hi, Tom. I just was kind of wanting to get back to you had said before about when you were younger and you talked about ringing. And you said in your ears, and I'm kind of a little bit of an experiencer myself. We won't get into, but I have to say when you said that you sparked something there with me when I was a child, and those same feelings, those same ringing in my ears that I had. I don't remember anything ever happening, but when you said ringing. It just really kind of just struck a chord with me. So I just was kind of wanting to hit on that a little bit.
Boy, I really appreciate that because I don't know what it means. Maybe it's just tinnitus. I don't know, but it gets my undivided attention when it happens. And now it doesn't even happen once a year. But as a child, I think it was happening every week or two. But when it does happen, it's very loud. It'll cause me to pause and notice it and wonder what's happening, and then usually doesn't last very long, less than a minute, and fades away. But I did have two things about that. One is I had friends who were into Sharat Shabad yoga, which is an East Indian yogic tradition that the way to find your way back to the creator is by listening for this ringing sound in your ears. And I have friends who practice that. I find it intriguing. I never got into it. And then I want to promote the Citizens Hearing website again, citizenshearing.com or .org, where you can get the DVDs of the hearings. I have now created a full typed transcript of the entire 30 hours.
All 5 days? You're kidding me.
My fingers hurt, and I work on it part-time. It's taken me 2 years, and what's been slow is I've attempted to footnote every fact, check the spelling of every general, of the spelling of every military base in Italy or Germany or France. Some of them are closed, and verify all of the factual data that was presented during the hearings. And I'm still working on that. And if there's any listeners out there with proofreading skills, I'm looking for a couple more proofreaders. I've had 2 people go through it. It's in pretty good shape. I consider it the congressional record-like document that will preserve the history of the citizens hearing. and it's not available for sale. It won't be available for sale anytime soon. Steve and Ruben and Jeremy are working out whatever's going to happen with truth embargo and trying to monetize the video of the citizens' hearings. If they could find a cable channel or something, they don't want to do anything that would diminish the monetary value of that product. So I'm just working on it slowly, privately. Someday I hope to just give it away, put it up on a website, whatever, and have that available as a permanent written record.
Well, speaking of websites, the guy who actually does a super fantastic job at drjradiolive.com, my webmaster, Tom Schaefer, has actually joined us and has something for you. Go ahead, Tom.
All right, so I got intrigued by your website, the people of the earth apologize.com.
Yeah.
So now I'm gonna give a little preface here. You're transmitting out via the internet out to the entities to apologize to
Yes.
them. Now I'm going to preface this. There is some talk out there, like we've got SETI, we've got all these outreaches going through radio, going out or listening, but it's all through conventional technology. How do you feel about these people who claim to channel extraterrestrials? Maybe they're right here, they're trying to talk to us through other means. How do you feel about that kind of thing? For example, I have a guy that I found on the internet. He supposedly channeled a message in 2003 from ETs, and he wrote it up. It was called The Message. If you look up The Message by Gene Ederman, you'll find it out on the internet. And they claim to have said, all we're asking is if you want us to show up, we will.
I don't know. I live in Utah where Joseph Smith supposedly had a vision and golden plates and translated all of that. It's part of the culture here. This is nothing new. It's been going on through all of human history. The Romans had the oracles who were channeling or speaking on behalf of others. I guess I'm a skeptic in that regard. I'm not I'm not a debunker. I guess I'm a skeptic. If somebody could channel to me the winning lottery number for next week, I will then believe everything else they have to say. But so much of the history of this has been proven false. I have friends who are into a character called Bashir, and
Yes.
I read some of that stuff. It looks really interesting to me, but I haven't got engaged in it. Life is short. I only have so many hours. There's an infinite
Let me
amount
ask
of
you
that kind of
this.
stuff to read.
Let me ask you this.
Yeah.
From what I'm reading, and see, I'm still out. I'm still trying to understand myself, so I'm skeptical as well. But aren't a lot of the ET contacts that people make, in fact, what you have mentioned earlier, some of the stuff that Greer does, a lot of it's all telepathic, and so I guess the difficulty is in proving it. But isn't their method? A lot of contactees say that they were spoken to telepathically. So
Yeah.
maybe these advanced races are trying to communicate to us, but we're dismissing it as pseudoscience when in fact there may be something to it. I'm just kind of out on it myself.
I agree. There may be something to it. I don't know, but if you take the body of all of that stuff, it's internally conflicted. It doesn't all fit together, perfectly, depending on who's doing the channeling or how many years ago they did it. I was with Dr. Greer in Crestone, Colorado, and we went out in the desert. We did the CE5 protocols. A lot of that had to do with raising our consciousness and getting into a meditative state. And the basic message, as I experienced it there from Dr. Greer and others, were if you couldn't see the ET craft that had partially materialized right in our presence, such that we were on the bridge of this ET craft, partially materialized, if you couldn't see that, it's because your consciousness wasn't elevated enough. And I felt very much like the kid with the emperor's new clothes. It's like,
speaking
sorry.
On these topics, actually, the other two co-hosts both have questions, and we can come back to you, Tom, of course. But let me go in order of who asked first. Go ahead, Chris, and then go Johnny, and then Tom.
Yeah. Well, like I say, I don't want to get too much into all because the majority of you already know what all happened to me. But
and they will know again when they do that super interview. But go ahead.
I had a close encounter with an orb 6 feet from my son and I.
Wow.
And I have epilepsy, and I suffer from grand mal seizures, and I suffer from small seizures. And I had been praying for that thing to come back. And I mean, I don't know. I mean, I don't know if it was my seizures that maybe had channeled it in, or the things work on another dimension. I just don't know. All I know, it's a reality. And so, I don't know what to believe myself, because for all I know, it could have been flying around that night and I just happened to come down on me because it knows I won't shut up. But nevertheless, that is the thing. I do have these seizures, and I don't know if I'm going to have a small one, if I'm having them or what. I mean, I've had them for so long, I kind of just work through them. And so when I hear the ESP and all this stuff of people channeling them in, well, for one thing, I don't ever want to channel the thing back. It's been a real stressful thing, but I guess it seems probable to me. I mean, I kind of look at it. It's just kind of wanted to chime in there and go in on that, which you guys were.
Well, don't a
hitting
lot of
on.
people,
Yeah.
Joe, you would be able to answer this too. Don't a lot of people who have encounters essentially have some sort of abilities or some after effects? For instance, after Rendlesham, we had, I know John Burroughs had heart problems, and other people have positive things, such as Jim Sparks has telepathy or other psychic abilities.
Yeah, I'm far from any expert in that field. I've probably read less than your average listener in regards to contactee experiences. I'll tell you what, I do find I've read a fair amount of the Edgar Casey material. I find that absolutely riveting. I believe that human beings have physical capabilities that are unexercised. I met Ingo Swann. I've been to 4 or 5 of the remote viewing conferences that are held every year. Been to lectures there. I've actually had a lucky hit in a remote viewing experiment that we did at one of those conferences. I think remote viewing, remote influencing, precognition, these are things that science ought to be studying. To the degree they relate to the extraterrestrial phenomenon, I'm far from any expert on that, but I'm intensely curious about it all.
Johnny's got a question, and that's actually what fascinates me about this. Go ahead, Johnny.
Basically, when I was in Indonesia, I'm here now, but when I was here 13 years ago, I interviewed a Japanese girl, and she told me a story. It was quite remarkable, and it went a bit like this. I won't take too long, but what she said is that when she visited America on an internship for a year or so, she started to hear American voices in her head. And she said that these voices were telling her that what she was doing was subconsciously, or ESP, working to help humanity in the future. And so she heard the voices, and then she continued to hear them, and then she went back to Japan and told her parents, and her parents said, well, we know a very good doctor, go and see this doctor. So she went to the doctor, and the doctor subscribed these tablets for her, and he said to her, take the tablets for 2 weeks. If you still hear the voices, we'll go from there. Anyway, she took the tablets, and he come back 2 weeks later, and he said, do you still hear the voices? And she said, no, I don't hear them anymore. He said, okay, then those tablets seem to work, so we'll leave it at that. But then what happened is she actually said to me, I was still hearing the voices. And the voices were American men and women telling me that what I'm doing is helping humanity for the future. And she said at some point she could hear an auditorium of people clapping her, telling her this thing. And then very recently, our last guest had a documentary called Montauk Chronicles. And in that documentary, again, the people were saying how through ESP, through voices in their head, they were working for the CIA to help things that were going on in the future. Sorry about the surrounding noise.
It's
I hope
okay.
you can sort of get an understanding on that.
Yeah.
I mean, that's fascinating. I also, I've read a lot of Richard Bach, or Jonathan Livingston Seagull Illusions. Richard was also one of the volunteers who Russell Targ and Hal Puthoff experimented with in their early remote viewing stuff at the Stanford Research Institute. And Richard wrote about that. And, Richard describes the process of writing as a best-selling author. I mean, Jonathan was #1 for 2 years, as not being an author creator, but being a witness of the words flying onto the page. He says that when he was walking along a dock in Long Beach, California, he heard a voice say, Jonathan Livingston Seagull, and he turned to see who said it. There was nobody there. So this trans-dimensional communication, or perhaps cross-time communication, is something that other authors have talked about. Richard Paul Evans, who wrote The Christmas Box. Ray Bradbury wrote a book called Zen and the Art of Writing. They talk about being more of a channel for the stuff that comes through them that they get credited with being the author for is almost a fraud. Like they weren't the author; they were just writing it and witnessing it as it poured out in front of them. When Richard came back to write the second half of Jonathan, it sat unfinished for several years. He said it was like the wall melted away, and he just saw this video, and he was trying to describe it as quickly as possible. I've experienced a little bit of that, just a taste of it, but boy, there's so much more that can be seen, felt, touched, experienced with the five senses. So if time doesn't exist, or if time's just an illusion, then the most perfectly evolved version of me is accessible to the version of me that's here right now talking on the radio, like right now. Like sometimes I feel the presence of that through time, more evolved version of me. And then I experience that in reverse. I'll be driving somewhere, maybe that I last drove 20 years ago, and I'll have this memory of the Joe from 1990 or whatever, before I met my wife or whatever, full of angst and upset and whatever, and I'll look over to where I used to be, traveling on that road. I know I drove this back in 1990, and I'll put my blessing back through time on that guy. I have that sense of this connection to what the Native Americans called the long body, the worm creature. If you could imagine your body from birth to death in one moment through time, it's kind of like a giant worm in terms of its shape and wiggling around on the earth. So that's what you've reminded me of, and I'm just rambling away now. But, near-death experience, precognition, remote viewing, remote influencing, all of this stuff is something that science ought to be studying, that we all ought to be engaged in, that we ought to be seeking out human beings who seem to have natural abilities in these things and learning from them. And I suspect very much that it relates to the ET phenomenon. Maybe there are people of higher consciousness or of a unique brain chemistry that somehow are able to communicate with advanced alien life in a way that I only wish I could. I don't know. But I don't study that a lot because it seems to lead to Alice in Wonderland craziness a little too quickly. And I don't have the ability yet to discern what's the most valuable and the least valuable out of all of that stuff.
Tom, I know you got more to say. Go ahead, Tom, before we wrap up. That's why I just want to get everyone to read.
I can totally relate to that. I mean, John and I have talked about this book that I wrote, and that book came to me in a similar sense. It was like I was watching a video and I had to write it down. And I don't know that John has talked about saying that it might have been a vision. And he and I have talked about this numerous times. And I couldn't say that. But I do know that the way that the material just seemed to roll, an unlimited supply, like I was watching a video, and all I had to do was write it down. So I understand what you're saying about that, very much so.
Yeah, and it's common across at least best-selling authors. Everyone I talk to about this. Richard Paul Evans, wrote this book called The Christmas Box. He wrote a book about writing it called The Miracle of the Christmas Box. And it came to him where he had to pull his car off to the side of the road and take notes right then in that moment, or it would get away. And he felt almost like he was being possessed or grabbed around the neck and shaken to write it. And then he went on to write a series of books. He was publishing one a year or so. And when I talked to him about the process of his later books, it was more of a struggle as a writer. He didn't have a re-experience of that almost channeled like communication. And he dedicated the Christmas Box to Sue, who was his sister who had been stillborn. So she never lived. She was a stillborn baby that they named Sue. And he felt, for whatever reason, it was Sue that was giving this to him, largely as a message to his mother. But it became a best-selling book. It reached number 5 on the New York Times bestseller list as a self-published book. Didn't have a major publisher behind it. Got turned into a made-for-TV movie that starred Richard Thomas, from the Waltons fame. So if you want to read a really interesting book about the process of writing, Zen and the Art of Writing by Bradbury and The Miracle of the Christmas Box by Richard Paul Evans describe that process of being taken over. And it's what Grant Cameron is studying now. He's gotten a little bit away from the presidents and UFOs.
Yeah, he's gotten into consciousness. You're absolutely
And it's,
right.
go to a Grant Cameron lecture on consciousness and UFOs, it will blow you away. He's onto something up there. Either that or the long winter nights in Canada have been having too heavy an influence on him. I'm not sure which.
Do you see the bridge from the dismissal of a lot of these topics as pseudoscience? A lot of that is, I think, is starting to come down as quantum mechanics starts to almost prove some of this stuff that
Right.
was mocked a few years ago.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't see it so much as pseudoscience or as I mean, science is what science is, which is replicatable laboratory study. And we sometimes think of it as the only legitimate form of research, and that's what's missing. I mean, science is valuable for the mechanics that it does, but it's
Here's the
not.
problem, though. By us having an understanding of something, that doesn't necessarily mean that that's the true way it is. For instance, 1,000 years ago, the Earth was flat. 120 years ago, we sure as heck couldn't fly. 70 years ago, 50 years ago, we couldn't make it into outer space. So it's just a matter of time, as Bob Lazar says, before we find that missing piece of the puzzle, which can give us access to control gravity. And as so many theoretical physicists talk about, once we can achieve that, things such as creating wormholes to possibly, making even time travel, which I never even believed to be possible. And now that I'm actually looking at it from a physicist point of view, I'm actually really enjoying it, and my eyes are opening up to a better point. And that just proves that what is science fiction can be proved to be science fact 20, 30, 50, 100, 200, 1,000 years later, if we just listen. We got about 5 minutes left of the show, and Johnny's got a question. Go ahead, Johnny.
Watching the Huffington Post the other day, and there was a statement online of, I don't think he was the editor, but I can't remember his name, and I should remember. I'm sorry about that. But what he said is that he was interviewing Cooper, the first astronaut to go outside the spacecraft, and he was talking about future events through ESP, going to Mars, going to other planets. And he said, "Do you know anyone?" And he said, "Well, you're looking at one, And so my understanding is that it's not a physical thing. We're not going to learn to fly mechanics. We're going to learn to travel through ESP, to master these crafts that are in Area 51 is all about ESP. It's not about physics. What do you think of that?
Well, first of all, it was Ed White was the first American spacewalker, and he was after a Russian. And I suspect you're referring to Gordon Cooper, who was the last human being. He's the last human being to orbit the Earth alone on the last Mercury mission, Faith 7. And Gordo wrote a book called A Leap of Faith about his experience in NASA and as a World War II pilot, where he saw the Foo Fighters. So as a young pilot over Germany, flying during the war in the 40s, he knew there were extraterrestrials here because he saw the Foo Fighters. And then he was at Edwards when they were doing a missile test, if I remember what I read in his book correctly, and a lenticular-shaped flying saucer did circles around this missile. And they got high-quality film of that, which they sent to Washington, and yet it doesn't show up in the Blue Book reports. And so he was kind of an early whistleblower. He and Ed Mitchell are the two most outspoken astronauts on this issue. And then it was Ed Mitchell who did the ESP experiments on the way back to Earth on Apollo 14 after they had gotten back safely from the moon and were on the way home. He had the spare time to experiment with some ESP work and had this numinous experience, this transformational experience.
And that's actually what got him to create noetic science.
Yes.
Right? Yes.
Because he saw the sun, the earth, the moon in the cockpit window as they did the barbecue roll on the way home. So the ship would slowly spin, so one side didn't get too hot or one side too cold. So it would just turn, and in the window...
The centrifugal forces, that's right.
Yes.
Exactly. They needed it.
Yeah, and it wasn't for artificial gravity because it was too slow for that, but it was enough to keep the temperature even on the skin of the craft. And in the window, as it spun, it was sun, earth, moon, and stars, I guess, in between. And he felt himself at one with the cosmos, which is a transformational experience.
Joe, we got literally, we're running out of time. So what I'm going to ask you is real quick to finish your thought, what Tom had about science. Then I want to ask you to give one final statement and plug in your site one last time.
Okay, I missed the first part. Something about science you want to
Yeah, Tom was asking you to finish that thought. Go finish, Tom.
You
Oh,
were talking.
right.
You were talking about science versus
Right.
pseudoscience and
Yeah,
progression of
I mean,
science.
science is what science is, which is it replicates things that can be studied. When I presented at the SETI Institute, so Seth Shostak was very kind to me, and I love what SETI does. I like the idea of listening for radio broadcasts. I did research on to what Marconi did on his yacht back in the 20s, where they were hoping to get telegraph signals from Mars. I mean, this search is admirable. I love it. And Steve Bassett and I disagree on this. He thinks the SETI people are part of a cover-up. But anyway, I went out there every other year. They do a conference called Contact Cultures of the Imagination, and I presented the highlights of the citizens hearing to the SETI scientists. And what they said to me was, eyewitness testimony doesn't matter in science. We don't attend to I said, this is multiple eyewitnesses with coincident radar returns. And they said, well, it's got to be replicatable. I said, how do you get an alien to replicate something? I mean, I think they're just siloed and so narrowly focused that they've missed the big picture. And that's the essence of science. So I don't degrade the rest of what we ought to be studying by calling it pseudoscience. It's another form that ought to be legitimate research. And then the other question I have is the human brain even capable of perceiving reality? Can we even perceive what the true nature of what's real is? We're like the fish inside the aquarium, and can we know what's over there in the kitchen or down in the basement? I don't know.
Joe, it's been such an honor to have you. One last time, plug in your website.
Well, I'm going to plug citizenshearing.org. Go there, buy the Citizens Hearing DVDs. If you want to send me an apology to put up on the peopleofapologize.com, if they are here and they're watching us, they can grok everything on the internet. It's a way of communicating.
And with everything being said, everybody stick around because Seth Shostak of SETI is actually coming up on Art Bell. First, let's go ahead and thank our very special guest, Dr. Joe Buchman, PhD. Of course, the Dr. J Radio Live team. Very special thanks to Keith Rowland, who's running this network, Dark Matter Digital Network. And, of course, Art Bell. Most importantly, you, the listeners, disclosure is in your hands. Go to the website, drjradiolive.com. You'll see upcoming shows. This Thursday, we'll have an update on Philip Corso. Next Tuesday, we have Richard Hoagland, who sadly had to cancel last minute last week, but he's back up. And we have so much more. Nassim Harriman's going to be back. Foster Gamble's going to be back. And YouTube exclusive interviews. All you have to remember is drjradiolive.com. This is Dr. J signing off.